Good evening, everybody. So nice to see you all again here today. Today is a special event. It's a Passover, but we are still the Liebling House. So just to tell you who we are the Liebling House White City Center, a prolonged arm of the Tel Aviv municipality and the German government. And I'm very pleased to see you all here again, although it's a holiday. And I have a special guest today with me, פיליפ Oswald. פיליפ Oswald was the director of the Bauhaus Foundation for a very long time, and he has a lot of knowledge that he can share with us. And of course, this is still very important as a sort of a slogan today in Tel Aviv and in Israel and in the world, because it was just also celebrated last year for its 100 years of inauguration. So what is the Bauhaus really all about? And where does it find us today? All of these questions are going to be answered by פיליפ with his lecture, after which we will be asking him, פיליפ, I'm sure are going to have fun debating this issue. But I'm really welcoming everybody to post questions and a Q&A, so we can have a lively, open cultural discussion with the community about the role of the Bauhaus today in Israel, in Germany, and in the world, and see maybe where it's leading us, and if we can revive its glory, although so many years have passed. So Phil, the stage is yours. Please start.
Okay, wonderful. Then I'm just sharing my screen and going to the presentation mode. So thanks very much, Sharon, for this kind invitation. So what I'm trying to provide in my short lecture as a pretext for our discussion is based on a book which I published a year ago on the Bauhaus. Because after doing a lot of work on the Bauhaus, I finally kind of thought that the phenomena can be not understood if you not kind of analyze the Bauhaus as a brand. Nobody is questioning that the Bauhaus today is a brand, and you know well in Tel Aviv how it's used as a brand. But my point is actually that this is not only a question of the reception and of the afterlife of the Bauhaus, but that the Bauhaus was from the very beginning a project which was heading to kind of establishing a brand. And that provides, of course, quite a bit of contradictions. It is a brand in the sense actually of an umbrella brand, because it has a lot of sub-brands. So it is a design brand for furniture, for example, or household items. It is a cultural brand which has a specific meaning in the German context as a form of national self-representation. So it's also politically very supported to give a good image of Germany in the world, which you could well experience in the Bauhaus anniversary 2019. It is a tourist brand in Tel Aviv or Dessau and Weimar, and a little bit also in Berlin. And it is an educational brand for the universities in these cities. It is a brand in the real estate business and for prefabricated houses, at least in Germany. And of course, it's also a brand in the art market. And so the particular point of the Bauhaus brand is, one of the particular points is that nobody owns anymore the brand. Normally, if you have like, I don't know, Coca-Cola or Mercedes, there is a company who owns the brand and who controls the brand. In the case of the Bauhaus, it became a participatory brand, as there is no registered brand mark, and everybody can use the name and can contribute to its production. So, and there were students from Weimar which kind of invented a few years ago the slogan, "My Bauhaus is better than yours," which exactly is hitting at this point. And so in this sense, you have quite a bit of brand cannibalism, which is, of course, eroding the profile of the brand on the one hand. On the other hand, it is also kind of course, supporting its effect, its presence. So it has like a negative side in the kind of erosion of the profile of the brand. On the other hand, it is kind of multiplying the effect of the brand. And of course, some of the cultural institutions still try to control the brand with some kind of access. The brand of the Bauhaus has a high, it's necessary for a brand, is highly recognizable, both by its very strong term of the name, Bauhaus, which was invented by Gropius, and also, of course, because of a certain form of visual production. I forgot to show you some slides. So here you see kind of different forms of typographic uses of the Bauhaus term. And so this is like this liquid brand of the, also of the form of co-production and participation, as I called. And here you have different websites of producers. So you see that kind of there are very many different products kind of marketed by the Bauhaus label. So from a hairdresser to kind of companies who sell planes. And so this is an example of the tourist brand. So it's on the tourist fair in Berlin, kind of representation of the city of Weimar. And this is like the an example of the historic brand production. And so the Bauhaus as a brand has this kind of clear iconography, as you can see here, and then we will see, of course, later examples, and you have them all in your brain. It's both for furniture as well as for architecture. And we associate a certain set of values with this brand, which is also very typical for brands in general. So we think that it's kind of sachlich, objective, functional, practical, efficient, high quality, modern, technically advanced, artistic, creative, innovative, timeless, universal, and of course, social. And so that is kind of the message this brand is communicating. But of course, brand in itself is kind of sense at least as much for commercialization, marketing, and promotion, which is not necessarily really kind of getting together with these kind of very honorable values which the brand is representing. And brands in general are more kind of emotional products, which kind of distort reality in order to give the consumer an emotional orientation and a binding to certain products. So there might be some contradictions regarding being Bauhaus a brand and being Bauhaus a social project, or a project of like really functionality. The assumption that the Bauhaus only became a brand in its afterlife, I would question. I think, as I said in the very beginning, it was intended from Gropius very much. And I think that was his strongest success to establish Bauhaus as a brand. But the Bauhaus brand in reality is quite something different than what we imagine the Bauhaus is. That is kind of my my hypothesis of my contribution now, and also of my book, which I try to kind of wrap up here in a short period. And in one sense, already the establishing of the Bauhaus itself with this label Bauhaus, with this kind of word, was the invention of the brand. Actually, there was no new school founded. Gropius became a director of two existing schools, which he was asked to unite. So he was rebranding what was there very successfully, but he was pretending that it was a new foundation, a new school, which it was not, as he also in the first years was very much building on the previous activities of the existing universities, of things Van der Velde as an architect and teacher has developed, of the infrastructure and even on the teachers. The second step for establishing the Bauhaus brand was the exhibition in 1923 in Weimar, which was like the public.
I'm sorry, Philip, to interrupt you, but maybe an interesting fact is that Henry van der Velde was then head of the school in Ghent, no?
Yeah.
And actually, Dov Kalmi, the architect of the Lieblinghaus, he studied there, so there's
very
a connection.
Connection, yeah, so a very interesting connection. And
yes, sorry for disrupting.
And so it's very interesting that if you look at what this exhibition was in 1923, you would assume that, I mean, it was presented as like the first presentation of Bauhaus products of the first 4 years of the school. So actually, when Gropius was initiating the exhibition, there was quite some skepticism among the teachers, because they said, we have not much yet to show. But the point was that Gropius said, okay, let's produce stuff for the exhibition. So the exhibition itself was less just showing what the school was doing the 4 years before, but there was many of the products presented exhibition was produced for the exhibition. So now here you see, as an example, the very famous director's room in Weimar. So if you hear director's room, you would assume that is the office of Walter Gropius in Weimar. But actually, that is not the case. It was not used as the office of Walter Gropius. It was a showroom to present the Bauhaus products in a setting which was pretending to be an office. But it was never used as an office. So if you see this image, that is what we know. But I was asking a photographer to make another image. You see here another image. That is the situation you experienced at the time when it was presented, as well as if you visited today. So you see here kind of a false wall and the curtain, which is kind of framing the showroom. And there is a kind of arbitrary room in front of it. So if you go to the ground plan, yeah, I think that's hard to see here now. But the point is that the showroom of the director's room was put into the Van der Velde building, but Gropius desired to have a square layout of the room. So he was needing to make this false wall to have this proportion he was looking for. And so it was not actually a functional room, because there was this room in front of it, which was never has any use, but it was necessary to have in order to get this proportions. And the actual room of Walter Gropius was 2 rooms to the left on the plan. Yeah. So which was presented as a director's room was just kind of a showroom. The same thing is with the kind of Haus am Horn, which was presented as a kind of home of living, but it was first built as a showroom, and then later on people lived there for a while. But the main point was this exhibition mode, and so it was architecture produced for an exhibition. That Gropius was so strong in kind of establishing a brand refers also to his work at Peter Behrens, where he was working before World War I for a few years. And Peter Behrens was like a very strong designer who was developing the first corporate identities, for example, for the AEG, German company you probably know. And he was not only producing the logo, he was producing all the marketing, he was producing the product design in this sense. So here you have a poster, and you see here also like traces of what we associate with the Bauhaus, like a triangle, circle, and square. And so Gropius, by working in Behren's office, experienced kind of this mode of brand production. And if we look into that, what Gropius was doing before the Bauhaus, it's very interesting. He's known as an architect for factory buildings, as like with the Fabruswerke in Alfeld, 1910. The irony of this project is what he was designing for this building was the facade as a mode of marketing. So he was not developing the building itself, because that was already kind of given the planning to an architect by the client. And Gropius was only called in with his colleague Adolf Meyer in order to make a marketing effective show facade facing the train station in the city, to kind of to establish the brand of the client who was producing Fagus kind of tools for making shoes. And Gropius was very successfully with his task, designing a kind of impressive facade. And so the client was very pleased, and he was using his design even for the logo in his advertising. And to make this point even more clear, we can go to the Bauhaus Lamp, which is probably the most single known Bauhaus product in general. And here you have a current photo of the marketing of this lamp. And you see already in this kind of photo how it's taken. It is on this kind of sitting in the window, and next to it, to the right, you see a sculpture. And actually, the lamp is not a functional object in this sense. It is more a sculpture in itself, or it is like a shape which is communicating, I'm the Bauhaus. And it is very interesting that people think that this is a modern lamp design, which it is in real terms, it is not. Which is, one hand, you see here the workshop where it was developed and produced. So there were no modern technical means in order to do so. It was all handcraft, and also then very work intensive and very expensive to produce. Even at a time when, of course, here you have a lamp production at the Bosch factory, where like mass production in modern terms was already very common, and but which was not available to the Bauhaus. So even so, the language of the design might associate like modern times, its actual production was not. And therefore it was also at the time already very expensive product, and also a kind of handcrafted product. Here you see that the typology of the lamp is something which is just like a redesign of lamps of the 19th century. You have here on the painting to the left, you have a lamp which is a gas lamp, and the design of this gas lamp is functional because you have, I mean, I'm not going into detail, but it reflects the necessity of a gas lamp. The designer Wagenfeld was using basically this typology and redesigning it for electrical purposes, having not more the gas, but electricity as a source. So it became a very iconic form here, for example, also used in an exhibition by Mies, and here is another exhibition. So basically the first use of this lamp was to be exhibited first in the Haus am Horn. It was not the final form, but like the interim design was presented in the Haus am Horn for the exhibition 1923. And its success was as a showcase, as an exhibition object. And in this way, it was extremely efficient in this kind of, in its communicative function, but it was not a very useful object for lighting. So here you have this interesting, the photograph, which shows on the right hand, the Wagenfeld lamp and the Bauhaus lamp. On the left hand, you see at the working table, the Milkrad lamp. That was a modern design. It was functional and it used all the possibilities of electrical lamps, because now the lamp became movable and you could have the lamp heading down to the working surface, which the Bauhaus lamp is not doing. So they and therefore the Bauhaus lamp is not providing a very very useful light. It is not, even so it was presented in the exhibition as a lamp which could be used for desktops, so at a working table or at the sideboard if you want to read. It was never used as such, but it was just kind of, it's good in providing some like of atmospheric background lighting, and this use was only learned later on, and its first use was this exhibition function. And so we made actually, which was now also used for the announcement of the event, this performance as part of an exhibition project where we was thematizing this kind of brand culture and iconic image dimension of the Bauhaus lamp in cooperation with Technolume, which is producing the lamps. And Technolume was in order to kind of strengthen the value of the brand, is fighting very much wrong copies, false copies, and not licensed, illegal copies of the lamp. And so it wanted an exchange of, it was collecting from the consumers their false lamps in return to a real, correct, reproduced lamp. And in cooperation with Technolumen, we got these false copies, and we was demolishing these lamps, as you can see here, which was, of course, irritating, because if you see these lamps as functional objects, it was a very destructive project. But in the question of the brand value, this was very productive, because demolishing, destroying the wrong copies, which is eroding the high quality of the brand, it was raising the brand value. So, and this is therefore also the producer of the lamp, Technolume, asked us to do so. So if I explain that with the Bauhaus lamp, we can also go to the architecture. So we all associate with the Bauhaus the kind of social housing, mass housing, modern housing, and so on. And as a famous example of Gropius and Bauhaus work on the housing is the director's villa in Dessau. And here, basically, you see Ise and Walter Gropius, and they sit there like almost like influencers, as we say today, to present to the wider public how to live. And for this, there was also a film produced, which had very traditional gender understandings, where the women stay at home and take care of the house, and the big master, the architect Gropius, is going out for work. And okay, and this dimension of influencers is also something where many Bauhaus products was first successfully kind of used in communication. Here you see like Piscata's home, which was also presented in big magazines, lifestyle magazine, or here by Fritz Lang, the apartment of Fritz Lang, which also has had these modern interiors. the point of the Bauhaus villa, of the director's villa, is that it is like more redesign of a classical villa, very on a, the site has 4,000 square meters. The building has also several hundred square meters. And it is in that sense quite traditional in its sense of the typology, in the sense of the gender understanding, also in the sense how it was produced. On the other hand, so you have this kind of phenomena of luxury, which is, and this is something, this is a little bit the irony of the Bauhaus brand, because it is more kind of into the high value range of consumer products, and it's very much used. So, you know, here you have an advertising of Knorr, which produces the Breuer chairs. And on the same time, people think that Bauhaus products are very social. So there is a contradiction regarding that. And as here you see an advertising of Porsche company with a kind of rebuilt director's villa. And so you see here there is this contradiction that in consumerism, actually, the Bauhaus brand is seen as like a high price quality brand. And in the political context, it's associated with social housing. And I think I have far too much prepared. So I will kind of maybe end soon here. If you look into the only mass housing the Bauhaus was producing is Dessau-Törten, and the first part of Dessau-Törten was produced by Gropius, and this housing estate is almost in every history book of modern architecture, and there the assumption is that this housing estate is modern, it is economic, it is functional. And again, nothing of that is the case. So there is an issue of functionality, which I basically, for example, the windows in the living room have been placed so high that you could not see out of the window if you sit down, and this was not accepted by the people living there. So it was changed soon after the housing estates was opened. There are other functional problems with these housing estates, but also there was enormous problem, and there was technical problems, which you can say, okay, if you have an experimental setting, that can be the case. But the main issue was that Gropius was proposing the project to the politicians as a form of cheap housing, but it ended up to be more expensive than very traditional housing production. And there was a big crisis when this came out after the opening of the housing estate. And actually that is like the secret and hidden reason that Gropius left the Bauhaus, because this problem, this crisis completely spoiled the relationship between Gropius and the Social Democrat political support in Dessau and its region. And so basically the housing estate didn't fulfill this promise of economic housing, but it was branded as such. And Gropius didn't succeed to kind of address the housing question, but he succeeded to brand himself, to establish himself as the Wohnfort, as the one who is kind of pushing prefabrication in modern architecture. So that is again a big contradiction. And so maybe I just look if there is something, and one has to say that maybe that is an important addition before we might go into a discussion, and that after the closing of the, so Hannes Meyer, when he took over the job from Gropius, was trying to reposition the Bauhaus brand. He was not against this brand business totally. He was actually the one who was registering the brand of the Bauhaus formally, legally. It was not done by Gropius, but by Hannes Meyer. And but he was questioning the formalism of the brand, which was a big problem. and where he only by kind of denying this attitude, he was succeeding actually to come to products which are more efficient, more economic, more functional, as with the Condem brand. But the irony is that even so, these lamps have been functional and economic and have been produced at a high number and to reasonable price at the time, they are very unknown to a wider public. So this is something which is not, I mean, it is not such an iconic object. It is not so usable as a fetish of consumerism. And so you see that in this consumption logic, kind of to have a kind of shape which is kind of allows this kind of fetishization, like the Wagenfeld Bauhaus lamp, seems to me more important than to be really economic and practical and functional. So there is not only to the Bauhaus a kind of very conceptual contradiction, but also on the level of the consumerism itself. So, but it is very interesting to understand these two concepts of how to use this brand and how to kind of address these Bauhaus ideas. And we could go also into the architecture where you can find the same phenomena. The bitter irony is that kind of, as you know, Hannes Meyer was kicked out of office in 1930, and the Bauhaus was closed in 1933, that after 1945, after the National Socialism and World War II, Bauhaus was used as a political brand in Western Germany, later on a bit also in Eastern Germany, but it was mainly used in Western Germany to present the Germany as, I mean, basically to give another positive image of Germany, which is contradicting its association with Hitler and the Holocaust, and to present it like the good side of Germany, to be modern, to be social, to be progressive. And for doing this, the exhibition 1968 in Stuttgart was done. And this was a total streamlined presentation and uncritical presentation of the Bauhaus, where all the kind of attempts of Hannes Meyer for kind of addressing the issues of the brand have been completely ignored, but it was going to this kind of iconic Gropius Bauhaus. And the irony in that is that all the main political parties involved in this project, from the different political bodies kind of financing and supporting the project, the main people was all former Nazis. So this is like Mr. Lübke, who was the Schirmherr, I forgot the English term for it, of the exhibition. So the Prime Minister of Germany, and from the Christian Democratic side, he has like a background in National Socialism, but he was nevertheless kind of presenting the Bauhaus stuff to the public. And so that is became then the later use of the Bauhaus brand to kind of redesign the image of Germany, and was quite successfully in doing so, even though there are quite some contradictions. I could go on with a lot of other things, but I think, Sharon, we better leave it at that. And I might show later on some images regarding Tel Aviv if you want or so, but I think we should have a little bit of time to talk.
Yes, Philip, thank you very much for this so far. Before we dive into Tel Aviv and what happened in Israel, I think because most of the crowd are Israelis that are not so knowledgeable in the Bauhaus perhaps as you are, I think we should also separate the Bauhaus terms into three, like according to the principles of the Bauhaus and their sort of impact. So could you just explain like the time of the three had headers or the principles of the Bauhaus at that time, and what their influence was actually.
Yeah, so
I mean, because you're talking about branding on one hand, on social values on the other, and I think one might understand it, the Bauhaus differently in those sort of terms.
Yeah, so basically the first and most known director is Walter Gropius, who was in charge of the Bauhaus from 1919 to 1928. And I would say his main mission was to establish the brand. And he was successfully doing so. And he was also kind of contributing to establish the Bauhaus style. Even so, the Bauhaus style is something which is not originating from the Bauhaus, but is something much more common in the general modern movement. But he was one of the actors kind of establishing this style, even so he was denying that there was the idea of a Bauhaus style. But he failed. I mean, the Bauhaus came into a crisis after its opening in 1926 in Dessau because of this big gap between the promise of the brand and its actual performance. And as a result of that, in my reading, Gropius withdrew from the job and proposed Hannes Meyer as a new director. And he was in charge for 2.5 years until 1930. And he was very political and social oriented. And he was criticizing the formalism of the Bauhaus and tried to open up to kind of a wider range of design possibilities. But he was kind of much more methodological in the way to kind of unite production process, design questions, and functionality. And doing so, he was really succeeding in this short period of time to initiate some product designs and some architecture, which was rather fulfilling this promise of the brand, but which they not provided was this like iconic forms, which are good for marketing. And so Hannes Meyer stayed more like a kind of known figure for insiders, for architects, but he's never appeared on the surface of like for the general public. And he was dismissed for political reasons in 1930. And then Mies van der Rohe came into the game for 3 years. He's of course very known. He's, I think in the meantime, almost more known than Gropius. It's kind of changing over time because he's like one of the great architects of the 20th century, like Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier. And I think he's by far better architect than Gropius. But his profile was to completely depoliticize the Bauhaus and to make it kind of a good design school for architecture, which he was doing so, but he was not more kind of identifying himself and then the school with this kind of so-called Bauhaus program of combining good design with social ambitions. So he said that social questions are political questions. They cannot be solved by designers, and designers should kind of deal with spatial and aesthetic questions. And doing that, Mies was very successful, and he was also very successful in a teacher. He was then continuing later on in Chicago, but he was not a person who was trying to connect design questions with social questions. So that is like this, the third reading of the Bauhaus. So it's quite interesting. You have as 3 directors, 3 very different concepts of how you could address this question.
Yes, thank you, Philip, for that. If we want to make the jump to Israel, though, then the second director, Hannes Meyer, is probably the most interesting one, no? And I mean, of course, we, you know, talk about Hannes Meyer in context of social housing, and his teachings of Aryeh Sharon are probably, you know, if we want to say Bauhaus in Israel, we might go through this sort of string. But social housing and what happened in Tel Aviv does not really go hand in hand. I mean, there were social housing projects and there was a lot of influence by Aryeh Sharon, but you cannot say that Tel Aviv is actually a social housing project as maybe, you know, they have envisioned. So if you were to define, and I know you don't, but if you were to define Tel Aviv in sort of the Bauhaus terms, how would you describe what happened in Tel Aviv in the 30s? Or how much do you think is there really an actual Bauhaus influence on what happened?
No, I think that the story of Tel Aviv is very different than it's kind of normally understood. And I'm not the first one who's raising this criticism or skepticism. There have been some, like Sharon Rothbard in Tel Aviv, in a little bit aggressive way, or also German researchers who was addressing this question and these contradictions which are connected to Tel Aviv. I might share some images again for this, because then it's better to discuss. So basically, what we have in Tel Aviv is, of course, that you have a lot of buildings built in the 1930s in the Bauhaus, in the so-called Bauhaus style. And so as Sharon, as you just mentioned, that of course, this is not social housing, different from the kind of famous estates in the Netherlands and Germany and Austria, or maybe also in Scandinavia, because the client have been private investors, which is all fine, but it was not intended for like low-cost housing, but it was more like the kind of bourgeois context of small investors building their own house and to have apartments to rent out. So it is not this type of European social housing of the 1920s. So that is very different. And it is not connecting to the Bauhaus at all, or not at all set to match. So we have several hundreds of designers which have been mostly educated in some way, not exclusively, but in some way in Europe, not only in Germany, they could be also in Austria, in France, in Poland, and so on. And they used the language of modernism in Tel Aviv, which is, of course, completely fine. It is a little bit ironic that it is, I think that, to my understanding, it arises in a moment where there is kind of more conflicts with the Arabic population in Palestine. And so using the Bauhaus style was something to implement a kind of architecture culture from Europe, which the immigrated Jews identified with in this context. And so it was also a way of distinction from the previous architecture and from the Arabic population. But there was almost, beside Aryeh Sharon, there was almost no Bauhaus scholar involved in this. So I think Bauhaus Tel Aviv would be not much different than without Aryeh Sharon, even so he became later on a very important figure for Israeli architecture. So there is an influence, but this is different than what we normally understand. And so it's very ironic that for establishing the Bauhaus brand then in a process in the 1990s, 2000, actually some original work by Bauhaus scholars was erased, which these images show here. I'm not explaining further. And in this process, it's like the branding of the Bauhaus Tel Aviv is something which was invented at the time from the 1980s, 90s. And is, of course, a very postmodernistic phenomena. And here you see a first housing estate in the 1980s using the Bauhaus as this modern language as a style. And then you have quite a bit of architecture of Bauhaus scholars in Tel Aviv. And here you have some photographs, especially of Aryeh Sharon, to the left, bottom by Smul Mustechkin, if I remember now right. And no, that's not. To the middle, and then to the left is another Bauhaus scholar, which is less known, but this is a memorial site for the victims of a concentration camp. So this is all architecture by Bauhaus scholars, but this is normally not presented as Bauhaus Tel Aviv, but it is. And what is also not presented as Israeli Bauhaus most of the times, I think a bit, but not so present to the general public, is like the kibbutz developments, which quite a few Bauhaus scholars played a very important role. And beside Ariel Sharon, Shmuel Mustechkin, and others. So, so that is interesting because that is also much closer to the Hannes Meyer understanding of the Bauhaus, because it's really functional, it's not so representational. But again, it's not fulfilling the desire for a kind of iconic style. Here, to some extent, but you have already a pitched roof, which is not understood as very modern, but it was very practical and reasonable to do. Or you have here other examples of kibbutz developments by a Bauhaus scholar, and there even so the iconic dimension is completely lost. So this is like a short comment that, so what is presented as a Tel Aviv Bauhaus has little to do with the Bauhaus, and what there is in Tel Aviv and in Israel, which is kind of connected to the Bauhaus, it is normally not regarded as such.
Okay, so you were mentioning the sort of whitewash that was done in the 60s for Germany, you know, trying to present the Bauhaus as something that was sort of away from the Nazi regime. And I mean, one can discuss a lot about that. And, you know, one can also mention, I think, all those, you know, Bauhaus scholars that did work with the Nazi government in the end of the day, like, I don't know, I could mention a few, even, what's the name of the guy who did Neufeld, who did, like, you know, Neufeld? Neufeld, all the norms and the books that we are still using, no, like he was, I mean, there can be a lot of debates about that, but I was wondering if we take it for today, no? Today there's also like there was a whitewash, we call it, like when people try to, you know, make something cleaner than it used to be. In Germany, you say Persil, no, like whitewash them. But now I find that there is a greenwash, no? Like now they're trying to, you know, take this movement and try to, you know, sort of pour it on the times that we are now dealing with climate crisis and the new Green Deal. Yeah. Can you tell us what is happening in this front? Because I think now it's, you know, the term Bauhaus is connected to this Green Deal, and nobody really understands where it's heading or what the idea behind it is. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I don't know if you already noticed, because it's also very present now on the political agenda, because the European Union is now promoting a project which is called European Bauhaus, which is exactly addressing this kind of greenwashing, if you want to call it like this, like this new green European Bauhaus. So that is the assumption, and or the claim, not the assumption, the claim they make. And I'm very critical of that. And I think we have in general a problem with question of sustainable design, green design, and so on, as kind of there is a certain set of shapes and forms which presumably kind of represent ecology, sustainability, and so on. So you can say, okay, it is sometimes like the more futuristic shapes. It is kind of, you have green facades, for example, or you have like the use of wood and some kind of informal kind of materials. You have urban gardening and so on. So these kind of phenomena are labeled as green, as sustainable. And it is again the problem the same problem than with the copious Bauhaus, that there is a certain value associated with certain shapes. And in the end, if you really critically look on these products, they not deliver what they promise. And I think we should be very critical about these claims in general. And I think that normally questions of functionality and economy, they are not reciting a specific form. So we should accept, even though it is kind of not good for marketing, that to address ecological questions and questions of sustainability, you can do in very different fashions, which is good because people have very different preferences in what they want to live in or what they want to use. So you can make very traditional, very avant-garde designs which could address these questions. And so this is kind of a promise of liberation of these kind of ideological fixations. On the other hand, it is an extremely danger because it's like, I would say in German, Ersatzhandlung, because if the people assume, if they buy and consume this kind of products or houses or whatever, they would behave ecologically, then this is not the case. And so there is stopping of some possible serious engagement in these problems. And there was a very interesting study about how people actually act. And so in a German context, it was researched that people who have high ecological values in their understanding and have a high income, they understand themselves as like post-consumers, green-oriented and so on. But in the end, their negative impact on the ecosystem and the production of greenhouse gases is much higher than compared to people which have much less income and which are critical about climate politics. But as they have less resources to consume, they have a much smaller ecological footprint, yeah? So, and this has to do with this kind of symbolic action. So if there is this kind of, you consume presumably ecological, so it is very dangerous because then you think if you buy these design products, you behave good, but in the end, it is not doing anything good.
Okay. Yes. What do you think there was this idea of van der Leyen to connect the Bauhaus with this sort of new Green Deal after all? I mean, what's the logic in that really? Or do you not find
this
the logic?
Is again, very simply, it's a kind of marketing and branding logic behind it. And this works to some extent. But I mean, it is like, I would say, a complete Ersatzhandlung. I don't know if you understand the word Ersatzhandlung.
I do. Ersatzhandlung, like, different way of.
It's a pseudo activity.
Yeah, pseudo activity.
You pretend something to do, but you don't do it. So, I mean, in the end, I mean, regarding the climate change, it's very simple. We know we have to produce less greenhouse gases. And so you should just kind of limit the amount of greenhouse gases which can be produced. And then you can have a kind of price system where you basically have to buy the license to produce greenhouse gases. And this is something you could kind of do in capitalism a very efficient way to limit this and to give a rigid limit to it. And the politicians and also to some extent the public is avoiding this. Instead, they produce like products which are supposed to be green. And so this is not solved. So in my understanding, the politicians need to do their job and establish rules which really stop economic issues. And in this frame, everybody could do his or her design, and this could be very kind of diverse, yeah? And so I think we should not mix up political issues with kind of aesthetic questions. And in this sense, it's very ironic, even so I'm a person who is very looking for this kind of how to connect design questions with ecological or social questions, but there is almost in this end where I approach Mies van der Rohe's understanding to say it can be problematic to mix up these two spheres.
Yeah, but I think they really try to do like sort of to use again this branding that you talk about in order to sort of make it more appealing to think design-wise in a way that, you know, ecologically products can be, you know, make them more appetizing for the mass, no, for the mass production, because today ecology is one and like design is another. So this use of the brand Bauhaus is just a matter of the politicians to sort of say, think about, you know, this sort of new ecology, new thinking of ecology is something that can be sort of well designed like the Bauhaus. I don't know if it's going to work or not. I don't think it can be, but still I think it's interesting to see how, again, after 100 years, we're trying to use this term in order to receive some sort of political statement behind it. So I think this is interesting. Yeah, so do you have any idea of projects that are happening now in sort of the Bauhaus Foundation that are interesting again? Or do you think that we should really look at the Bauhaus as some sort of archival material that we should maybe work on and with, and not refer to contemporary issues at all with this sort of notion of Bauhaus?
It's a difficult question. In my book, I give an answer to it in a longer essay, which I'm not kind of can now do in this kind of short moment we have here. But I think on the first hand, I think it is healthy to first accept that the Bauhaus is a historic fact, and to develop some critical distance in kind of looking in his shortcomings and successes. Yeah, so I think that not everything was great about the Bauhaus. There was things which was good, and others things failed, and so certain things address more these questions, and others those. So we have to kind of clear up our mind and not assume that everything which is associated with the Bauhaus is great. Yeah, so that is the problem, I think, with many things, especially with historic facts, that there is this kind of desire for an idealization which kind of stops critical thinking as such. The second thing is that I think that to address current design questions, this cannot be based on reconnecting to the past. I would say that the first thing we need to do with current design questions is really to ask, what is the question, what are the tools, what is the aim, and use our current knowledge in order to do so. Nevertheless, of course, historic cases can be a source of inspiration. I would never question that, in both in the prototypical solutions or also in methods or in attitudes. So of course we are all not like a kind of white papers where we start from scratch. We all have our inspirations and influences. And in this sense, of course, and I'm very much fascinated by the historic phenomena of the Bauhaus. I think there is, of course, quite something one could kind of connect to, but also more like use it in a maybe cannibalistic way, not be like correct, but look how it could be appropriate in an interesting way. But I think that one has to be a little bit, how to say, a little bit locker, so not so rigid in this reading, And one has, I mean, if you look, for example, to the Hochschule für Gestaltung in Ulm, which was in Western Germany, the design school, which has an enormous impact on German design and also on international design. And this is sometimes a little bit labeled as like the post-war Bauhaus. And I think I have a really very high appreciation for what they achieved. It's really great. And there is, I mean, it is like, in a sense, as close as you can get to the Bauhaus afterwards. And it connects much more, in my understanding, to the Hannes Meyer Bauhaus and to the Gropius Bauhaus, and has nothing to do with Mies van der Rohe. But nevertheless, even so, it is, to some extent, really close to the historic Bauhaus. Its success is not based that they did an historic reading of the Bauhaus. The success is based because they have really been up to date in the questions and methods. And there was some kind of, they reassured themselves looking back on the model of the Bauhaus, and also they used in the political context the Bauhaus brand in order to collect money for the institution, yeah? Or also in the publishing and marketing of their work, there was some connection. But the kind of conceptual core of it was not based on a historic reading. It was really established on the current condition. And I think that is very important. And only if you have this like not so, I mean, such a linear understanding of how you could relate to the Bauhaus, then it can become productive. But if it's too narrow-minded, or if it's seen as a starting point, it will never work.
Thank you, Philip, for those words. I think this is summing up the idea very well. I think a critical understanding of everything that we do and we did is very important in order to, you know, create the future, because see something as a brand and, you know, close it with that is always very dangerous, I find. So thank you for those words. And you did a lot of research, and you're such an amazing scholar. So I think that, you know, all your conclusions must be right. And I'm looking forward to what you're going to research again. Yes, it's like, you know.
Of course, I mean, you also have... Yeah. And you of course need to be also critical with what I'm saying, but
I should be critical of you. Okay, that's the next step. Yeah.
But thanks very much for the invitation. I wish everybody could pass over, and yeah. Yeah,
well, this it's going to be in our archive, and it's going to be then afterwards posted in our Facebook account, and also it's going to be in our Liebling webpage. So I'm sure there's a lot of people who are going to see this interesting, you know, lecture you did, and perhaps connect again to the Bauhaus in its essence, not only in what we know here in Tel Aviv, but rather to look at it in a sort of broader perspective. Yeah, so thank you again, Philip, for joining us. And I hope that we will do more projects together, perhaps also already working on one, but we're not going to tell anybody about it just yet. So I hope to see everybody again next Monday for another lecture. And Philip, keep safe and well in Germany. And I hope to see you again soon.
Yeah,
have a nice evening.
Yeah, be in touch.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.